Alright. Hello everyone. I miss you guys a bunch. It's gonna be kind of wild to me. I've never recorded a presentation, so we'll see how it goes. Anyways, I did the Kissimmee River, so let's do this. So, the Kissimmee River once meandered over 100 miles from Lake Kissimmee down to Lake Okeechobee. During the wet season, heavy rains would fill the river and send excess water into the adjacent floodplains, filling over 30,000 acres of flat marshland with water. And the scale and duration of these flooding events allowed for a rich biodiversity of flora and fauna to inhabit the region, as there were many species of waterfowl, fish, alligators, eagles, aquatic invertebrates, even the potential for some river otters, as we got in the picture down there. And this is all thanks to the variety of ecosystems you can find around the river, around the floodplain wetlands. Um, they provide a lot of space for animals to kind of take up. So whether it's in the water, they can hang out near the riparian areas, in the wetlands as well. So there's also a lot of resources available and a lot of available niches for these organisms. Alright, so here's where it gets bad. So these flooding events weren't compatible at all with human settlement, human land use of the region, and in addition, with prolonged flooding of the Kissimmee and nearby cities due to hurricanes in 1947, the citizens began to demand proper flood management efforts within the region. And so with that, after about 20 years, the meandering Kissimmee River was transformed into the C-38 canal you see here. So it's that big canal in the middle. The canal was straighter, wider, and deeper than the original meandering river. And water control structures, the same one you see here in the middle of the slide, these halted the flow of the river, creating stagnant reservoirs, so the river is no longer flowing in these areas. And the floodplain wetlands, which were usually directly outside of the river, were drained, and this opened space for development and agriculture. And so the channelization of the river, as we could have guessed, had numerous adverse ecological impacts, including the sudden decline of many wetland-dependent flora and fauna populations due to the draining of the wetlands. Nutrient sediment exchanges weakened significantly with the halted flow of the river. And groundwater decreased in quality and quantity when the wetlands were drained. That would be a usual source of recharging that groundwater. So with the drainage, there was not a lot of recharging. And nutrients from the floodplain agriculture also allowed the growth of algal blooms, which cut dissolved oxygen and severely impacted aquatic life in the canal. And so kind of taking a step back and looking at some kind of terms we tackled in class before this, we can look at how channelization and the stressors that were accompanied by that impacted fauna populations in this river and floodplain ecosystem. So looking at the fish populations of the river, we could see a transition from the largemouth bass that were once common prior to channelization, and a transition from that to more tolerant fish species. So these are fish species that could tolerate the algal blooms and the lower dissolved oxygen rates. And so this feeds into the idea that without proper management techniques, we would see these algal blooms, these lower dissolved oxygen rates, and these tolerant fish species, we'd see them stick around for a while because we know there's going to be some resistance from that eutrophic state to that mesotrophic or even oligotrophic state. And this is kind of the term we came to know as hysteresis, which is that resistance from that less desirable eutrophic state to the more desirable state, the mesotrophic or oligotrophic state. Yeah. Alright, so here's where it gets better. About 20 years later, after recognizing the channelization of the Kissimmee River and the drainage of those wetlands was a management nightmare, Congress enacted the Water Resources Development Act, and this provided funding to restoring the Kissimmee River. And so some of these restoration efforts included backfilling over 20 miles of the C-38 canal, reacquiring floodplain land that had become privately owned in the meantime, re-meandering the river, so reestablishing that flow, as well as biological monitoring. So that could be surveying or monitoring these flora and fauna populations within the region, looking at species richness, species abundance to kind of assess the process that's being made since since channelization. And so the South Florida Water Management District established a performance evaluation program which takes on a comprehensive measurement of many components of the ecosystem, including water quality, hydrology, amphibian and reptile populations. There's a lot of measurements. There's like 25, so I'm not going to dig into all of them, but yeah. And then once again, kind of taking a step back and looking at some of the stuff we've kind of tackled in class before, looking at the temporal aspects of these restoration efforts. So we can expect in the early stages of restoration that we want to reintroduce those primary producers and primary consumers. So that's going to be like your hydrophytic vegetation, your insects, basically any herbivorous fauna as well. Those are going to be the ones you want to bring in first, so then you can attract those secondary and tertiary consumers with the availability of those lower trophic levels. So having a food source for those consumers is going to be key to making sure you do get all those trophic levels and that you're doing it in the correct order, because just throwing an alligator in there with no food sources available is not going to help it, establish stable population within like Kissimmee River. So it is very good to see, like in this bottom picture, that they do have those alligators around, that they actually do have food sources available, and those lower trophic levels are doing a fine job at reestablishing their population. So, oh yeah, and so this is kind of a research I decided to dive into for the Kissimmee River. So this is like one of the measurements of the success of the restoration efforts. They do avian studies. So they looked at the reestablishment of wading bird and waterfowl populations at the Kissimmee River. Some restoration efforts that have been expected to reattract these avian populations are stuff like reintroducing naturally fluctuating water levels, seasonal wet periods, reintroducing the historic vegetation communities, and yeah. And so post-construction aerial surveys beginning in 2001, so that's kind of this graph on top, and they have been going on from 2001 and are still continuing today, which is awesome, have indicated a positive restoration response so far, in that species richness and abundance of wading birds and waterfowl have increased, which is awesome. And each individual 3-year running mean was not significantly different from the restoration target. So when I say the 3-year running mean, I mean like each of these individual bars, that's going to be 3 years. And so they were not individually significantly different from the expected density, so that's 30.6 birds per kilometer squared. But the mean annual 3-year running mean was significantly higher. So when I say that, I mean like all of those bars together, like the average of all of them was significantly higher than the expected amount. So that's really cool to know that over time, these bird populations are doing well when you take into consideration past years, but we would like to see the individual years for the future to be significantly higher. Huh. Alright, sorry, I got lost. I'm at the end pretty much, so. Anyways, here are my questions. I'm not going to read them out loud. I think you can just pause them and then kind of think about them. Yeah, and then here are my sources. And that's it. Thank you for listening. I hope it was easy to track. I've never done this before. So, yeah, hit me with your questions. Thanks. Bye.